Today, we're going to be talking about emotion. So what is emotion? Definition of emotion is a response of the whole organism. So we're talking about physiological arousal, so that's biological, expressive behaviors. So think about how people express their behaviors with hand gestures, facial expressions, things like that, and a conscious experience, meaning like you're aware of the emotion that's being given. So question to you. Does your heart pound because you are afraid? Or are you afraid because you feel your heart pounding? So think about that for a second. There are three theories we're going to talk about to answer this question. I'll give you the definition with examples. Make sure that you can think of other examples besides the ones that I give you. All right, so the first theory we're going to talk about, first theory of emotion, is the James Lange theory of emotion. So remember William James, we talked about him beginning of the year, he was a functionalist. That's the James we're talking about. So this theory says the experience of emotion is awareness of physiological response to an emotional arousing stimuli. So if you look at the diagram, I think these diagrams do a good job of helping you understand what it is. So first you have a stimulus. So the example here is a car coming at you. All right, so that's this one right here. So you see a car coming at you, that's a stimulus. Then you have arousal. All right, so then you have arousal. In this situation, your heart starts to pound. Then you have the emotion, which is fear. All right, so James Lange theory. So does your heart pound first, and you have the emotion, or are you fearful? Then your heart starts to pound. The James Lange theory says that you have arousal, then you have emotion. Right? This example says your heart starts to pound, then you have fear. Right? So try to think of other examples that can fit in for this. So you always have some kind of stimulus, right? Try to change it up, right? Don't use the same one so you have a better understanding of the theories. The second theory is the Cannon-Bard theory of emotion. This theory says emotion arousing stimuli simultaneously trigger physiological responses and subjective experience of emotion. So this one says you have a stimulus, so the car is coming at you, and at the same time you have arousal and emotion. In this scenario, it's your heart pounding and fear. All right, so this says it happens at the same time. So Cannon-Bard theory of motion says the arousal and emotion happen at the same time. The third theory of emotion is the Schachter's two-factor theory of motion. I love saying Schachter's two-factor. A lot of people remember that for some reason. All right, so this one says to experience emotion, one must be physically aroused and cognitively label the arousal. So you have a stimulus, then you have arousal and a cognitive label at the same time, then you have the emotion. So this example, you see a car coming at you, that's the stimulus. Then you have the arousal, your heart pounds, and at the same time you cognitively label, I'm afraid, and then you have fear, which is the emotion. All right, so this is Schachter's two-factor theory of motion. If you notice, it's the same one as the James Lange theory. All I did was add the cognitive label at the same time as the arousal. Right, that's why it's called the two-factor theory. Right, because those two things have to happen before you get to the emotion. This video I'll post on the YouTube channel, which I recommend you watch. As we've talked about, a lot of people say they help. Cognition and emotion. The brain's shortcut for emotions. All right, so we know the amygdala is the emotional center. All right, so a lot of times you see something, it goes to the thalamus. Remember, your thalamus processes all of your five senses except for smell. Then it goes to your visual cortex. Then it goes to your amygdala. right? And then it goes to your heart starts to pound. Well, we have shortcuts, right? So we have shortcuts for like emergencies. So your thalamus gets it, and like, hey, there's a snake. Let's go straight to the amygdala. Let's skip the visual cortex. And so you start reacting and you start getting away from the snake before you even realize exactly what you're looking at. Same thing like if you pull your hand away from something that's hot, a lot of times you'll pull your hand away before you even realize it's hot. Because we've talked about this before, how your brain can take shortcuts in your neurons when they process things. 2 routes to emotion. All right, so you have an event that can lead to an appraisal. All right, so you can appraise the situation, label it, and then you can have an emotional response. This is the Lazarus and Schachter, right? This is where the 2 Schachter theory comes in, where you cognitively label something before the emotional response. Or you can have an event and then you just have an emotional response. Right? So that's kind of like, you just go straight to the shortcut before you even appraise what's going on. That's what we were just talking about before. So Jajonc and Ledoux discuss this theory. So the 2 dimensions of emotion. So when you see like a chart like this, you got your quadrants, and so you have positive and negative, right? Positive up top, negative down here, above and below the line. You have high arousal over here on this side, low arousal here. So it's just what kind of combination. So if it's positive and high arousal, you tend to see joy. If it's high arousal and negative, that's like fear or anger. If you're low arousal with positive, that's like something pleasant, relaxing. If it's low arousal and negative, that's sadness. Emotion and physiology. So we talked about this when we talked about the nervous system. If you remember, the autonomic nervous system controls physiological arousal. So the sympathetic, remember, all this happens automatically without your awareness. So sympathetic division, those are arousing, emotions. Let's say you see a cat, or you think you see a cat, right? Your pupils dilate, salivation decreases, skin perspires, respiration increases, heart accelerates, digestion is inhibited, secrete stress hormones, right? So the adrenaline is pumping. Well, then your parasympathetic division kicks in. You calm down when you realize it's just a little kitty cat, right? So your pupils contract, you go back to normal. Salivation increases, skin dries, respiration decreases, your heart starts to slow down, digestion is active again, and you have a decrease in secretion of the stress hormones. The Yerkes-Dodson law. All right, so this is something you want to make sure you know. This shows the relationship between arousal and performance. So it states that performance increases with physiological or mental arousal, but only up to a certain point. So when levels of arousal become too high, performance decreases. So pretty much what they're saying is there's an optimal point of arousal. So arousal is just, like how much you're aware of what's going on. So notice if your arousal is weak, your performance is weak, right? The more aroused you are, aware of what's going on around you, so think about like having a good night's sleep, you're aware of what's going on around you, you have better performance. But then there's a peak. And what this says, too much arousal, and then your performance decreases, right? Impaired performance because of strong anxiety. So if you have too much arousal, that's when like people tend to get like stage fright. You all of a sudden you stand up on stage in front of all these people and like your mind goes blank, right? That's what we're talking about here, right? So too much arousal, you get anxiety. So in every performance, there's a different amount of optimal arousal, as we'll see on the next slide. So what this is saying, performance peaks at lower levels of arousal for difficult tasks and at higher levels for easier or well-learned tasks. So if it's a difficult task, right, low arousal is better, right, for the optimal performance, right? You want to be calm. For something's difficult, you have to think through. If something's easy, high arousal is good. So if it's something like you don't really have to think about, like you can almost do a second nature, high arousal is better because then you can do it quicker. So if you get in front of the class, also you see everyone staring at you, right? Too much arousal, then you tend to maybe not perform well. But if you're sitting at your desk doing that same problem with no one looking at you, then your arousals are lower and you perform better at that task. That's why coaches say, practice all the time, because you want to make it like second nature. Because the easier it is to do the task, the higher arousal will get you a peak performance, which is more productive. LeChunk. Define human emotions and their relations and combinations. So pretty much this consisted of 8 basic emotions opposed in pairs and multiple shades. So basic emotion and their opposite. So you had joy to sadness, right? So you had like joy here, sadness, and then trust to disgust, fear to anger, surprise to anticipation. So as you can see, the closer to the center you get, the stronger the emotion is. So like with sadness, the stronger form of that would be grief. If you go out, the less one, pensiveness, right? The higher form of joy would be ecstasy, outside would be serenity. And so you see that for each of the pairs, the more inside you get is like the stronger emotion versus the outside. Like look at trust. A less form of trust would be you accept them. A stronger form of trust would be admiration. Lie detectors. People always want to know about lie detectors when we talk about psychology, and they want to become like human lie detectors. So what we use for lie detectors is a polygraph. It's a machine commonly used in attempts to detect lies. Measures several of the physiological responses accompanying emotion, right? So there's 3 main things they look at with a polygraph. Your perspiration, are you sweating? Cardiovascular, show your heart rate, and breathing changes. The theory behind this is that you can maybe fool one of them, but it's very hard to fool all 3 of those. So this is what like an old school polygraph looked like. So a lot of people in like maybe the government, like CIA, that type of stuff, have to take polygraphs a lot. So usually when you do a polygraph, you ask them a control question, something that you already know the answer to, and then you get a baseline read on them, because everyone's going to be different, how much your heart rate is and perspiration and things like that. And then you ask the relevant question, did you see the deceased threaten to harm you in any way, whatever it is, and you base it off the control question to see if they're lying or not. And a lot of times, the answers or the results might be inconclusive, right? It's hard to tell one way or the other. And I know like in movies, they'll like have like a thumbtack in their shoe or something like that, and they'll press down on it when they answer every question. So every question has like a high response rate of like perspiration and heart rate, because they're stepping down that thumbtack every time. And the CIA and like those type of people are trained to pass one even when they're lying, like if they're caught, which is all right. So emotion and lie detectors. So a study was done, and the results was this. So they did lie detectors on 100 people. 50 of the people were innocent. 50 people were guilty. Right? They're the thieves. A third of the innocent people were actually declared guilty, and a quarter of the guilty people were actually declared innocent. Right? So this shows that lie detectors were about 70% accurate. Now that's not very good. Sometimes people are like, oh, 70%, that's good. I mean, if I was one of those 30% and I was innocent and I was found guilty, I'd be pretty mad about that, right? Even if it's like 99%, imagine if you're that one person who is found guilty when you're really innocent. That's why lie detectors aren't used that much, unless you're talking about like a talk show and they're trying to see who the father is or something like that. It isn't used that much in court. So, is 70% accuracy good, like I was just talking about? So assume 5% of the 1,000 employees are actually guilty, right? So you test all 1,000 employees. That means 285 people will be wrongly accused of the crime. I mean, that's not good. Let's say 95%. A lot of times we think 95%, that's pretty good. Now assume only one person of the 1,000 was actually guilty, and you test all 1,000 people again, right? You're going to have 50 people wrongly declared guilty, and one of the 51 testing positive are guilty. So that's less than 2%. which you might think is good, or you might not if you're one of those wrongly declared guilty ones. So looking at these faces, do you see the happy face first or the angry face? Studies have shown that people more speedily detect an angry face than a happy one. Right? So these are all like even neutral faces except for two, one happy, one sad. Most people tend to see the sad faces first. Now it could just be coincidence where you are looking, or maybe we're just more pessimistic and we always tend to see the negative than the positive. I mean, hopefully we can change that. My goal is to hopefully have more people positive, more optimists out there than negative, but that's what studies have shown. We tend to see negative emotion more than positive emotion. So expressed emotion, some studies show based off gender. I don't think this will surprise people too much. So men are in blue, women are in green. Women tend to be more sad, but they also tend to be more happy. They also tend to be more scared, which just shows women tend to be more emotional than men. And that could be a cultural thing. Men are taught to, hold in their emotions more. So Paul Ekman, who we talked about earlier in the year, did a study on expressed emotions. He found that there were culturally universal expressions. So a lot of facial expressions, he found this with babies as well, is universal. All right, so like look at A. What do you think A is doing right there? What about B? C? Look at D. What about E? And lastly, we have F. So no matter your culture, you can pretty much tell the emotion that they're expressing. All right, so just make sure Paul Ekman found that expressions tend to be culturally universal. So experience emotion, right? So what are the ingredients that go into it? And this goes back to kind of the theory. So we have emotion, but usually we're talking about three things that go into it, and they all cycle around, right? So you have arousal, physiological. You have cognition, appraisal, right? So you're labeling your emotion, happy, sad, frustrated. And then you express your emotion, right? Maybe by a facial expression or something like that. Right? So usually those, it's like a cycle. They all play on each other. Right? So if you express something, then all of a sudden you realize the expression you have in your face, and then you cognitively label that. Maybe you didn't realize it at first. Right? So they can all play on each other. Those are just the different ingredients that go into it. So C. Izzard found that infants naturally occurring emotions. So once again, infants, they naturally have emotions that they have. So if you look at these different babies, right, they all have different emotions, but they're all universally pretty much the same. And we can see some happies, some frustrated. I'm pretty sure D here has the sour face. You have something sour, that sour pucker face, right? So a lot of different emotions that we tend to see the same with babies throughout the world. Experience emotion, right? So we've already talked about this. We know the amygdala is your emotional center, right? Is the key to learning fear. And there are some rare people. There's an article I have about some people who don't experience any emotion at all. Um, it's a long name. I don't want to butcher it right now, but the article talks about I think only like 400 people in the world, and it talks about this lady who doesn't have fear, and because of that, fear can be a good thing. She's been robbed or been held up twice by gunpoint, twice by like knife point, because she has no fear. The article talks about one situation, someone calls her over with like her two kids, and she goes over there and they try to rob her, and pretty much she threatens to like kill them, right? Because she has no fear. And so you can see how sometimes fear is a good thing, because you look at a situation like, hey, that looks a little shady. Let me not go over there, right? And get yourself into that bad situation. All right, vocab word you should know is catharsis. This just means emotional release. So the catharsis hypothesis says releasing aggressive energy through action or fantasy relieves aggressive urges. So a lot of times we have these aggressive urges, maybe to be violent or whatever, but we're going to do something to get rid of it. Maybe it's working out. Maybe it's fancy. Maybe we just envision being violent and fantasize about doing something, but you don't actually do it. So remember, catharsis is just that emotional release to get rid of that negative energy, but not actually do it, not to give in to those aggressive urges. The feel good, do good phenomenon. People's tendency to be helpful when already in a good mood. You ever notice when you're in a good mood and you tend to be nicer to people, right? You tend to hold the doors for people and do different things like that. So that's the feel good, do good phenomenon. So hopefully if you do something nice for someone, then that'll put them in a good mood and then they'll do something nice for somebody. Subjective well-being. This is a self-perceived happiness or satisfaction with life. Right? So it's very subjective. It's your perception on your life. So used along with measures of objective well-being. So physical and economic indicators to evaluate people's quality of life. So obviously you have objective well-beings, like, that's like your standard of living. You make so much money, you have, so many materialistic things, whatever. That's objective. Those are things you can measure. Subjective is your perception on it, how happy you feel, how satisfied you feel with your life. So how we experience emotion throughout the day. If you notice, so negative emotions in blue, that's pretty even throughout the day. Um, Usually it spikes when you've been up about 12 hours, right? So usually at night you get a little tired, a little cranky. Positive emotion, those when you first wake up, it's pretty low there, pretty low. As you start to wake up, it's pretty high. And then as you start to get tired, you're not so positive anymore. And then that's why we need sleep, right? So that's why it's important to get enough sleep every day. Changing materialism. So this is how we've kind of changed over time. So if you go back to the 60s over here, this is the percentage rating goal of as very important or essential. So the blue is being well off financially. So we're talking about materialistic things. Less than half the people in the mid 60s thought that was like the most important thing. As the years go on, you see how materialistic we become as a country, and eventually it kind of levels off with about 3/4 of people, being very well financially and being very materialistic as being extremely important. And we are so materialistic now. I mean, kids have so many more toys than they did 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Even now, even people without a lot of money, a lot of them have like iPhones and Jordans, and different things like that, which just shows how we value materialistic things more than we used to. So the other thing says developing a meaningful life philosophy, right? That used to be the most important thing, right? Over 80%. Notice as people care about money, they care less about, having a meaningful life philosophy, and that being their motivation, for their emotion. And you're seeing that leveling off in the 40s. So does money buy happiness? Kind of, to a certain extent. Pretty much what it says is that we found out is that once you make enough money to be like well off, like where you don't have to worry about money, making any more money doesn't make you any happier. Right? So as long as you're not worried about like where your next meal is going to come from, and you have the safety, we talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as long as you have the safety of a house, transportation, stuff like that, being rich doesn't make you any happier, right? You can buy more materialistic things, but as long as you are financially well off, you're not going to necessarily be any happier. So, um, but if you don't have money and you're struggling to, buy food to survive and safety of a place to live, now money obviously can make you a little bit happier. So values and life satisfaction. Once again, we see this here where life satisfaction and money, you see where it kind of overlaps, how important it is to you. So if money is extremely important, we tend to have less life satisfaction. Where if love's the most important thing to you, you tend to have more. And money's not as important, you tend to have a higher life satisfaction. So people who value money tend not to be as satisfied with their life, right? Which once again shows you that money's not everything. It is until you can support yourself and have to worry about it. But if that's all you care about, then people tend not to be as satisfied with their life. The adaptation level phenomenon. Tendency to form judgments relative to a neutral level. So brightness of lights, volume of sound, level of income. So pretty much what it's saying is, so this is defined by your prior experience. So are these lights bright? Well, it depends on what you're used to, right? Is this loud? Depending on what you're used to. Level of income, once again, is depending on what you're used to making. So thus, if our current situation, whether income, social prestige, or whatever, increases, we feel a sudden increase in pleasure, right? You get a promotion at work, oh, you feel great. Well, then it starts to level off, is what this says, right? Remember we talked about sensory adaptation, where you get used to like the water, it's not cold anymore after a few minutes. Same thing here. You kind of get used to the increase, the promotion you had. So it feels great at first, but then you don't want that to be your only promotion of your whole life. So that increase of pleasure you get from that eventually wears off, and that becomes the state of normal. And then it requires something even better to give us another surge of happiness, right? So where you're never satisfied with what's going on with your, especially if we're talking about social prestige or income or something like that, you want to keep increasing it. So there's something called relative deprivation. This is the perception that one is worse off relative to those with whom one compares oneself. So back in the day, Alex Rodriguez had got a huge contract, right? And so now this is kind of normal. But at the time, this was so much more than everyone else, right? You got 10 years for $275 million to play baseball. So imagine if you're another player and you got a huge contract, right? Let's say you got like 10 years for $100 million. $100 million is a ton of money. But then compared to Alex Rodriguez's, you're not going to be feeling so good about yourself. That's why it's very important not to compare yourself to other people, right? You have to do what's best, what your best is, right? Your best is your best. And too many times people always want to compare themselves to others. Right? Psychologically, that's not a good thing. It's not good for your emotional well-being to constantly be comparing yourself to others when you just have to do what's best, what your best is. So what is happiness? So researchers have found that happy people tend to be have a high self-esteem. So especially like in individualistic countries like the U.S., they tend to be optimistic, right? That's why I'm always telling you guys to be optimistic, not pessimistic. They tend to be outgoing, agreeable. They tend to have close friendships or satisfying marriage. Have work and leisure that engage their skills. Have a meaningful religious faith. Sleep well and exercise. Sleep, a lot of people talk about how they don't get enough sleep. Well, that really does affect your emotions, and exercise does too, right? So we talked about runner's high with it, releasing endorphins and stuff like that. Those things really do help your emotions. And so going back to having like close friendships, it's not how many you have, right? So it's quality over quantity, right? So if you have like thousands of like Twitter followers, Instagram, whatever, doesn't mean anything, right? Because you don't really know those people. It's all about the close quality friend, like true friends that you have. And we'll discuss that more during the abnormal unit. So what are some things that have no bearing on how happy you are? Your age. You can be young, old, doesn't matter. That doesn't affect your happiness. Your gender, right? Women, we talked about, tend to be more depressed, but they also tend to be more joyful. So men and women both be happy. Education levels. Doesn't matter how much education you have for how happy you are. Parenthood, having children or not. So it doesn't matter. Some people want children, some people don't. That doesn't affect how happy you are. And lastly, your physical attractiveness. Doesn't matter whether people think you're gorgeous or ugly. That has no bearing on if you're happy, right? Because it's all subjective. And then lastly, we have SEALS general adaptation syndrome. So pretty much this is known as GAS, by the way. So it happens in 3 stages. First stage is the alarm reaction. So we're talking about this is your reaction to stress. So you have some kind of stressful situation. First phase is alarm reaction to activation of your sympathetic nervous system, right? So your heart starts to race, blood is diverted to your skeletal muscles. That's for a couple reasons, because like if you're like stabbed or shot like in your abdomen, you don't bleed out as fast. So we talked about the sympathetic nervous system before. You know, as part of your autonomic, that's when you have arousal takes place. The second phase is resistance, a sudden outpouring of hormones. So if you ever find yourself in this situation, like a fight or flight situation we talked about with the hypothalamus, all of a sudden you have this huge adrenaline rush, right? You have this huge adrenaline rush where you hear about people doing crazy things because they have so much, adrenaline going through them. Then phase 3 is exhaustion. So your reserves, your hormones are depleted. So you use this huge rush, now you have the crash. Right? And you're more vulnerable to illness or collapse afterwards. And so, this could be to a stressful situation like, like a fight or flight situation, but it could also be to like finals. So, like I know, so my wife, was a very good student, straight A's, and during finals every year, every semester, in college, she kind of went through this herself. Where she stayed up all night studying, always got her A's. But then every single year, the week after finals, she went through the exhaustion phase, right? She went through the resistance where she was, pumping through, studying, doing all that stuff. And then, she exhausted her, reserves of her energy. And then she would always get sick like the week after finals, right? And that's because she had reached that exhaustion phase. So this could be it's a reaction to stress, but stress there could be many different indicators or causes of the stress.